So I'm Katie Hood Morgan. I'm the assistant curator in the Exhibitions and Public Programs Department here at SFAI. I helped organize our current exhibition, which is Francis Cape Utopian Benches. And I don't know if you've stopped in on your way to the lecture hall, but we'll definitely be going there after this for a little conversation to follow the lecture. This is the second to last day of the show, so y'all got here just in time. Tonight we're pleased to co-present a lecture by Dr. Randy Oxier, followed by the conversation. We are co-presenting the event with the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness Forum, which is an interdisciplinary lecture series at the California Institute of Integral Studies. It's the first time we've collaborated with them. I'm really excited. It's kind of a perfect fit, the subject matter of the talk and our exhibition. And just really briefly about the show, as some of you might know, it's an installation of 17 poplar benches which are arranged in rows that fill the gallery space, and each bench was precisely replicated from existing benches crafted by American communal societies. And their form and design closely reflect their use within the specific communities, and by extension, the organizational structure and collective values of the communities they come from. Of this work, the artist has asserted that material culture reflects social structure. We've organized a series of events within the context of the show that have included a film screening with women homesteaders on the Mendocino coast, a conversation on the benches with a former Black Panther Party member, and an excellent talk by an architect studying utopian building design. We're excited to hear Randy's contributions and thoughts related to communalism and utopian imagination. I'm going to introduce Matt. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks very much, Katie. I don't have too much to say other than to thank the Art Institute for contacting me and Jessica, in fact, who is making this possible for us tonight. Usually the PCC Forum is run over at our campus, CIS campus on 11th and Mission. All of the forums are open to the public, so for those of you who are interested, we have a website, pccforum.wordpress.com. There are videos. This lecture, in fact, will be recorded as well. If you don't know anything about CIS, it was founded in 1968. It's about 1,400 students at this point. We have a School of Professional Psychology, School of Philosophy and Religion, Comparative Religious Studies, also a Bachelor in Completion program. With that, I want to introduce a professor of philosophy and religion and the former president of CIS, Robert McDermott, who will introduce Randy for us. Robert.
I just noticed that you're not up close here, you're out of the light, so, Randy. Thank you all for coming, and I'm very, very excited about this collaboration, which we're going to keep going and advertise, and all the people who aren't here will be envious by tomorrow morning. So thank you, Katie and Jessica. And welcome to you all, and welcome to Randy. And if I were to tell you everything about Randy's academic career, he wouldn't get a chance to talk. This is an extremely productive, prolific professor of philosophy, but also a musician, and with many, many interests. When I was just starting in my philosophy career, the single most impressive books on my shelf was called The Library of Living Philosophers, which had a autobiography and then 20 essays and then a response from this famous living philosopher. And I just thought, that is sort of the peak of the academy. And Randy now is the editor, so I bow. He's also a great expert on Josiah Royce. He just gave 4 lectures on Josiah Royce in Grass Valley, where Josiah Royce was born, and now he's going up again on Monday to give another 4, which is what philosophers do on sabbaticals. I could go on and on. He's a wonderfully exciting person, and professor and writer, editor, and also a musician, which I think is just really awesome. And so, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Randy Oxier. Yeah, no.
Figuring out where the lights are. So if I stand here, I'm in that light, all right. All right. Okay. Gotta get this worked out. Those were actually supposed to be just printed out. They're going to be not all that exciting as notes. What I wanted to do was talk our way through the American version. Interrupt me at any time you like, by the way. Although we have a discussion after this, we have to go and sit on these benches when this is done. And so our full-blown discussion can wait for there. There's a good bit of history involved in this, but I'm not going to, I'll just throw history out there really quickly. It's the ideas that are carrying the history from my point of view. One can get lost in the history of this stuff very, very quickly because it's so interesting and there's so much of it. And there's so much variation from one group to the next if you're talking about these various movements in especially the early 19th century. I'm pretty sure that all of those groups that have their utopian benches over there come from this time period of the Second Great Awakening. Now, of course, some of these groups still exist, and others do not still exist. So the history it's always, have you ever noticed you read a biography of somebody, it's always the first 2 or 3 chapters that are most interesting, and then it just, after that, yeah. Because what we're looking for when we talk about the histories, I feel like we're looking for the causes, the thing. What did everybody think before anybody knew what was going to happen? And once it actually starts happening, it's not nearly as interesting anymore. And so the early history of these utopian societies, to me, is a lot more fascinating than the story, especially of their decline and disappearance. Some of them succeeded to a rather grand degree, and others, they'd succeed for a while, and then fall apart into infighting, and then others, they never really succeeded. You've got a small group of mutually committed people who are going to try some kind of an experiment, and it actually works, but they never grow. And so these the various societies that we're going to talk about, there are hundreds and hundreds of utopian projects in the history of the United States. And they're certainly not by any means limited to those that came out of the Second Great Awakening. One of the reasons to talk about the Second Great Awakening is that it was such a big deal, and there were so many big utopian societies and communal experiments during this time period from 1790 to about 1840, that it made a lot of people in the world think that the Americans had literally lost their minds. That there were so many people doing this kind of thing, starting new religions. Now, there had been in Europe a very colorful history of separatists, spiritualists, various kinds of folks who had been nonconformists and dissenters. And so it wasn't new by any means in the kind of Western context or the Western culture. It wasn't new by any means for folks to be breaking off and then going off into the country somewhere and living apart. And some of the benches come from groups of people who had broken off and done what they did in Europe for a while, and then it looked like they were going to be able to do better what they intended to do over here, and so you have groups of folks coming over here. From the very beginning of the colonization of North America, that sort of attraction, you see groups. I mean, I think about the Moravians as a good example of folks who came over very early on to set up their own community in Georgia and in South Carolina. And they're still there, and more of them came over, but there's still Moravians back in the part of Eastern Europe that they came from as well. And so this Second Great Awakening, 1790 to 1840, I mean, the Moravians had already been here for almost 100 years by the time this stuff happens. So I don't want to suggest that somehow we're talking about an isolated phenomenon or something that was entirely new. What makes the Second Great Awakening so interesting is the scale and the success of it. I will give you, right off the top of my head, 3 names that don't mean anything to you now, but will mean something to you when I tell you what these groups are called now. So Campbellites, doesn't mean anything to most of you. Millerites, you've probably never heard of them. Russellites, you've probably never heard of them. But you've heard of the people that they became. And so to just sort of, if I can tantalize just a little bit, I throw out William Miller and Joseph Russell and Thomas and Alexander Campbell as groups, as names that you haven't heard, but they come from this time period, and they started movements you've heard of. Of course, there's also Joseph Smith, but if I pull that one out, you're going to know who that is, right? All right, so Second Great Awakening. What happened? Well, what happened was this. All of a sudden, the governmental structures that were associated with religious life as a result of the American Revolution, the governmental structures were taken away. All of the sorts of formal punishments for not being Church of England, or for at least not conforming to one of the larger denominations like Presbyterians or the various Puritan groups that came over here in order to escape the Church of England. Once the Church of England pulled out, it was a free-for-all. And if you think about it spiritually, think about that, instead of thinking about politically what kind of control England exerted over religious practice, including in their colonies, although it was a lot looser in the colonies than it was back in the old country. If you think about it for a second, all of a sudden the state association with religion has disappeared, and everybody's looking at everybody saying, you know what? We can do anything we want to. You know all that stuff that bugged you about the church you grew up with? Not, let's go away from it. Why don't we just redo it? Let's fix that stuff. Furthermore, if you understand the revolution not as a political event, but as a spiritual event, because religious people tended to see the hand of providence in what happened, and these folks are, there were an awful lot of religious people who had come over here for one reason or another. And so when it turns out that the big bad British are chased off by the Anglo-American colonists, there were plenty of people who were willing to see this in almost apocalyptic terms, which is to say the New Jerusalem has descended from heaven and has landed upon the shores of what we're now going to call the United States of America. And so we have this singular opportunity to get it right. And so people diving into their Bibles or diving into their esoteric writings of various sorts, saying, this time it's going to be different. This time we're going to get it right. And if you could get 6 other people to believe your version of it, you got the makings of commune, right? And for some people, some portion of the Scriptures had really caught their attentions. But if there was one thing that really seemed to divide the utopian thinkers and those who saw the opportunity of eternity in the present, if there's one thing that divided them, it was a couple of passages in the book of Revelation that they understood differently. And this argument goes all the way back. It goes back to the early days of Christianity. The religious meaning of a new nation is we have a shot at being God's chosen people, God's favored people, God's exceptional people here. And that means that we have to define ourselves over against something else. Generally speaking, in the colonial days, the over against defining had to do with other religious groups that were invested with political power of some kind or another. In other words, the Puritans in Massachusetts or the Catholics in Maryland. And so whoever it was, or the Anglicans in Virginia, whoever it was that the British government had made a deal with in order to, or Providence Plantation for the Baptists in the case of Rhode Island, right? Whoever it was the British government had made a deal with, those folks tended to represent the old guard. And so if you're going to define yourself over against something, it's going to be one of those things. Somebody who made a deal with the devil before. And a lot of this depends on where you are. Who made the deal with which devil, right? And so one of the things that what you might call the proto-mainstream, it hadn't become a mainstream yet, but the Baptists and the Methodists were essentially people who didn't have any money and hadn't made a deal, but they worshipped like, Methodists worshipped like Anglicans, and Baptists worshipped like the Puritans plus free will. And And so there was a recognizable sort of tendency in Methodists and Baptists. The difference was the ones in America who were left behind after Britain pulled out, they didn't have any money. They were poor. They didn't have any manners. They didn't have any breeding. They didn't have any training. And so as a result of this, you end up with a lot of folks with a whole lot of religious enthusiasm spreading out through the colonies and heading westward at an astonishing pace, which is why to this day we have so many Baptists and Methodists. Those folks they were different enough from the high church Anglicans and the intolerant Presbyterians and the groups of folks who had made a deal with the British devil. They were different enough that they could catch on with ordinary folks, but they weren't so crazy that they scared people. This wasn't really new. What it was is it was an adaptation of an old way of doing the religious life that was sort of suitable to the frontier. It was a little bit more down home, wore sandals instead of boots, that kind of thing. And so you couldn't say of the Methodists and the Baptists exactly that they were important in this Great Awakening because there was a lot of enthusiasm there. But you can't really say they were mainstream because they didn't have enough manners or enough learning to be mainstream. But they ended up being reliable, middle of the road. And so that's why there are so many of them. So that's why I got the question mark next to the mainstream. But here's one thing they are. They are non-utopian. And they're not terribly communal either. Because their understanding of community doesn't have anything to do with the attainment of some grand kingdom of God. Methodists and Baptists, pretty much like Anglicans and Presbyterians and Catholics, what they do is they sort of plug away at life in a plodding fashion, and they don't really expect Jesus to return all that much. If Jesus does return, actually probably most of them are in trouble, and that includes me since I'm a Methodist. And so if Jesus shows up, nobody's going to be more shocked than my church. And so we're pretty middle of the road, and it's at least it's not dystopian. You can look at it that way. And so there's a sort of what you might call semi-conscious religious life that is lived by, virtually everybody in the mainstream. That's just not enough for some people. Some people want to know the meaning of life. Some people want to dig a little deeper. They want to understand what it was that we are intended to achieve in this life. And there are lots of different ways to achieve that. The two groups that started out looking like they were mainstream, but they kept asking too many hard philosophical questions, end up with some more blah religion. That's Unitarians and Universalists, right? These are people who are offended by the religiousness of Methodists and Baptists, right? Universalists, they say, reform among the Baptists, it says, I don't like that hell part, so everybody goes to heaven. And then the Unitarians are essentially, these are the ones who come from the Congregational and Puritan churches who get fed up with how narrow-minded that can be and say, that Jesus stuff, oh yeah, sure, he's a great guy. One God at most. So one of my favorite quotes about Unitarians, there is at most one God, right? And so you find all of these folks, and what characterizes them when it gets right down to it is that they're all post-millennialists. This comes from that. A couple of passages in the book of Revelation in which it seems to imply that what brings the kingdom of God on earth is the work that we do on earth. And when we've done our work, then and only then does Jesus come back. This is comforting to a Methodist, because it doesn't look like that's going to be anytime soon. In fact, it's almost unimaginable that we should do enough to bring Christ back. Good. I didn't really want him to come back because I have no idea what happens then, but if I believe that stuff in that apocalypse book, it looks like something to be, if possible, let's defer that, okay? Armageddon and, raptures and things like that, that makes me nervous. And so postmillennialists are people who say that Christ comes back for the second visit when and only when we've done the work of making all the world into disciples. So I got an idea. I'll call my neighbor, invite him to church. I've done my piece, right? Jesus, you'll just have to wait another 1,000 years. All right. So with that said, that's the blah stuff. Then you have more interesting people, people who are more serious about getting an answer. There is a difference between apocalyptic societies and merely postmillennialist societies. But so let me talk about the postmillennialist societies that are more serious than Baptists and Methodists. There are three up there, and one of them has a bench here, the Community of True Inspiration, also called the Amana Colonies, because they moved to Iowa eventually, and there are 6 or 7 small towns up there that are still occupied, and so that group is still in existence. The Restorationists are most definitely still in existence. That's the first name I promised you. Does anybody know what they're called now? Anybody ever heard of the Disciples of Christ? Right. Or the Church of Christ, because they joined and then they split again. So the Church of Christ or the Disciples of Christ, those are the Campbellites or the Restorationists. And then there's Christian Science, which barely still exists. It used to be very popular. They're struggling these days. I'm not sure exactly why, but in my lifetime, they have really declined. They're not out of existence, but they have. They're all postmillennialists because they understand their job on earth as bringing about the kingdom of God. But the difference is that unlike Methodists and Baptists, inviting your neighbor to church is not going to do it. It's going to require a little more effort than that. The Restorationists are also what are called primitivists. And I'm going to spend a little more time with them than I would with others because Josiah Royce was a Restorationist. These folks think that about the instant that the Christian church went wrong was about the instant that the original apostles died, and particularly they liked Paul. They admired, in terms of a utopian community, these small churches that existed in the first century, in the 50, 60, 70 years after the life of Jesus. And so, being a very scholarly and extremely smart bunch of people, what they tended to do was to dive in and dig in to learning what those communities were really like. And to say, okay, what their manners were, what their etiquette was. And there's actually quite a lot about this in the Bible, especially the book of Acts is just full of stuff that gives you how it is that people who call themselves Christians or disciples of Christ are supposed to live, how they're supposed to eat, how they're supposed to worship. There's really quite a lot of stuff there. And so the Campbellites, what they decided to do was see whether or not they could throw the whole 2,000 years worth of church history out the door. Say, you want to know what our doctrine is? We don't have a doctrine. We've got the New Testament, and we have the freedom to interpret that as a completely self-sufficient guide to life. And you don't tell me how to read it, and I won't tell you how to read it, but here's what we do in terms of our practice. We live like that early church in the way that Paul especially described it, but also the way it's described in the book of Acts, and the kinds of things that Jesus did. So what that means is that you would think that this is going to be an anti-modernist or a Luddite or some kind of a throwback movement. But in fact, these guys aren't like that. They do believe in living in the world that they live in now, so they're not anti-technological. But when it comes to the community of worship, they're primitivists, is what it's called. What they want is they want the real raw thing. And they don't recognize the Orthodox Church liturgy as being primitive. They see that as overlaid with years and years and years of pomp and circumstance, all of which is unacceptable. They also do not at all feel sentimental about the loss of 2,000 years of Christian history, all of which they think is misguided. Right? So that primitivism you find in a number of utopian communities. Of the benches in the other gallery, a good number of those come from folks who are primitivists in about the same sense. But of course, they don't all have the same primitive practice. But they all agree in some way or another that the right way to go about Christian life shared together, the way to create the kingdom of God on earth, which is what they're trying to do, has to do with getting away from church history. So they're taking the American Revolution and its spiritual meaning as an opportunity to wipe the slate clean, start completely over, and say, this time we're not going to build a worldly institution. We're going to be in the world and not of it. And the way we're going to do that is by sticking as closely as we can to what we understand the primitive church to have been. Not all of these people would be describable as fundamentalists by contemporary standards. They're not all inerrantists. They're not all literalists. In fact, in their day, these people were regarded as wild-eyed progressive types because they were so conservative that it was crazily progressive. They were hippies, basically. I mean, what kind of person forsakes worldly things to go off and live with a relatively small group of people in which you cannot accumulate things, you can't loan money, or if you do, you can't ask for it back, and all of the original sort of prohibitions that are in place that prevent the early Christian communities from becoming worldly, well, they're going to put those things back in place. Now, that does not always mean anti-modern, but in some cases it does. Sometimes they avoid technology. Interesting thing about the Campbellites, one of the things that led them to split into the Disciples of Christ and the Church of Christ, which I think happened in 1906, they argued for 100 years and then they split, was some of them wanted to use instruments in worship, and others said that the Scripture is silent on the use of instruments in worship. Right? And the few things that Paul does say about instruments are not all that good. Right? They actually split over this. It was one of the main contentions. There were a few other issues too. But so, to this day, the Church of Christ, no instruments. Disciples of Christ, it's up to the congregation. Some of them use no instruments, but most of them do. But you can see how this is a camel's nose under the tent issue. If you start letting people bring instruments into worship and you don't know whether that was part of the primitive church, then the next thing you know, you'll have stained glass windows. So you have a question?
Yeah. Instrument.
Yeah.
Candle? Musical?
Musical instruments. Yeah.
Oh, musical instruments.
Yeah, musical instruments. The fight was about organs. They were fighting about whether you should have an organ in church. And if it had just been a guitar, I wonder if they'd have had, but an organ is a real commitment, right? It felt worldly to some folks. It's especially back then. It's not you could just go to Radio Shack and get a Casio now, and turn it up, and it sounds like a pipe organ. But not back then. It really meant it, and I don't mean to make light of this argument because it's actually symbolically about as clear an example of the argument over what that primitive worship would be like. The folks who went with Church of Christ, has anybody here ever attended a service of Church of Christ? They all sing four-part harmony. It's beautiful. Those folks can sing. You grow up singing four-part harmony. And so, sometimes they do have a pitch pipe, but usually there's at least somebody in the congregation with perfect pitch, and that's not even necessary. So it's a beautiful thing to listen to. And if you bring the organ in, what happens? The people become passive about that sort of thing. They don't sing at all. But if you go to a Church of Christ service, you'll hear some of the most beautiful four-part harmony. Everybody in the congregation learns to sing, and the reason they do is because that's how it's done. And they imagine, and this is what inspires them spiritually, they imagine that that eternity in the present sounds like this. This is the music of heaven. It's the human voice. But of course, there are plenty of other people who go, no, you want to know what heaven sounds like? It's a really good organ. So anyway, but the Restorationists, Disciples of Christ like organs. Not all of them. The way they did is they just left it up to the individual congregations, and most of them wanted organs. So Disciples of Christ tended to be in the west and the north. Church of Christ tends to be in the south, but that's not a completely. So Josiah Royce comes out of this tradition. He lived 1855 to 1916, and so he lived to see the church split, but he had left the church long, long before. So my main object. All right, just quickly, I told you about Russellites and Millerites. Now you know what their names are. They were originally called, the Millerites, Seventh-day Adventists were originally called Millerites, and Jehovah's Witnesses were originally called Russellites. Most of these come out of the same area of the United States, which is upstate New York. It makes you wonder whether something was in the water, because it wasn't just these folks. The Mormons came from there too, and they're still with us. Shakers had started in Europe as shaking Quakers. They were British, but their name is actually the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing. You can see why somebody needed to shorten that to the Shakers. And we have, of course, a couple of, I saw two in there, wonderful Shaker benches. The Shakers, a couple of things to say about them. Part of the reason that they, if you know only one thing about Shakers, what is it you know about them? Apart from the furniture. They shake. Celibate. Yeah, that's the thing people tend to know about them. In other words, they build their utopian community out of conversion alone. They take a vow of celibacy, and if you should turn up, the parent of a child, you're out, because they are preparing for, and this is what makes them apocalyptic. There's no point in having children. Jesus is just around the corner, just over the bend. But this is not, it's not as simplistic as it sounds, because the Shaker furniture is a perfect symbol of how they really saw the relationship between eternity and the kingdom of heaven on the one hand and worldly life on the other hand. People would say to them, you think Christ is coming, why do you bother to build such sturdy furniture? Right? Because in fact, one of the things that continued to support the community wasn't just the furniture, but it was their various industries. And their industries became popular even though things were a little more expensive because the quality of the workmanship was so high. Right? You want something good, get a Shaker to make it. But what is this? Well, there are two or three things to say about it. One is the little bit of advice that they would pass down, which is make each piece of furniture or your next piece of work as though it were the last thing you would ever make. And, knowing what your destination is, make it so that you could use it for 10,000 years too, because that's the same thing. Eternity is present in the work, here, now. The kingdom of God is not deferred, it's present in your work. And so if it's present in your work, don't slough off. By cheating God, you only cheat us all. And in cheating us all, you cheat yourself, right? So this is not like some silly superstition. It's actually a way of looking at life such that the kingdom of God is at hand. Eternity is present in time. It's not that time is contained in eternity. It's the other way around. It's that eternity is present in time. Now, here, available in your next act. I think that's a pretty interesting way of looking at time, especially if you understand that what you do, first and foremost, you do for and to us, and only secondarily to and for you. It doesn't matter what you think about what you're doing, it's a question of what you're actually doing, which is either building an eternity you can't inhabit and no one would want to inhabit, or building an eternity that everyone would want to inhabit. And there's no in between. There's no subjective eternity because we all have to live with everything you do. This is a communal philosophy. This is an apocalyptic philosophy that actually does not stand or fall with whether Jesus shows up tomorrow. It's sustainable as a set of ideas. Live the eternal in the moment. You've heard it in other philosophies, but perhaps the Shaker version of it would be relatively new to you. Quick story about the Seventh-day Adventists. Initially, they started following this fellow by the name of William Miller, who had done a whole lot of mathematical work with the book of Revelation and had worked out the exact date upon which the millennium would begin. Very, very fancy calculations, and apparently the guy was a good preacher. And so he gathered a really rather large following. And it turned out that he had the day and the hour figured, and so everybody gathered on the mountain to wait for Christ, and it didn't happen. So he went back and he said, I made a mistake, and he recalculated it, and they did it again like 7 or 8 years later, right? And it didn't work. People were beginning to get a little disenchanted with William Miller by this time, but they had found each other in the meantime. And a young woman from Colorado by the name of Ellen Gould Harmon White heard about this Miller fellow, wandered up to New York, and it turned out she was a pretty good preacher too. And so after the second time William Miller failed, Ellen Harmon White had a friend in Battle Creek, Michigan by the name of Kellogg, Dr. Kellogg, who had some interesting ideas about Christian diet. And so she said, let's go to Michigan. And so they did. Eventually, they came to California too. But the Seventh-day Adventists, that's how they started. They started as apocalyptic, and you can still find among the Seventh-day Adventists, does anybody know some Seventh-day Adventists? I mean, they're around, yeah. There's a lot of them. They worship on Saturday. They have interesting... one of the things that's interesting is that they started out as an apocalyptic group, looking for the second coming of Christ, and for the and they are premillennialists, which is to say, it doesn't depend on us. It depends. Christ comes down from heaven, and that's when the 1,000-year peace. By the way, millennium. When I use that word, I'm talking about the 1,000 years of peace, love, and joy that where Christ reigns on earth. That's promised in the book of Revelation. And what they're arguing over is whether that comes about because of our work or whether it comes about because Christ comes back and brings it about using the power of the divine. So the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses they are premillennialists and think that Christ is going to do it himself, and will, if we are faithful and believers, we'll get the benefit of that. And they also think, generally speaking, that we get to live through the whole 1,000 years if you happen to be here at the time. Furthermore, there will be a resurrection for the faithful, so that all the faithful get to live through the beautiful. That's your reward. And then there's a final judgment and heaven. All right. There are also apocalyptic restorationists, but that doesn't affect anything that I'm going to say. Those are the folks who sing harmony. All right. I'll go through this one fast because I've talked for too long already. There were philosophical and secular movements. They're not all Christian. At the same time, as part of the same Great Awakening, you find folks who move away from organized religion, move away from Scripture, but they don't move away from wisdom. They don't move away from spirituality. They don't move away from piety. And so one of the reasons that we need this up here is our Zohar separatists, followers mainly of Jacob Boehme. They have a bench in there, and so we need to understand something. There's a mysticism here, which is intensely spiritual, and here's the basic thought that you find over here on the stuff that I'm calling philosophical. It turns out that whatever consciousness is, that's what's real, and there's more to it than what we are thinking at any given moment. Consciousness is the real structure of reality. Physical, material being is just a sort of an eddy in the current of consciousness. It's slowed down consciousness. So if you want to know what's going on here, it's not unconscious. The stuff that you might be inclined to call material, what that is it's stuff that's moving so slow that the consciousness in it is not vital at the moment. But that doesn't mean it's not consciousness. And so the cosmos is constituted by variable kinds of consciousness, and consciousness that is being dragged downward by the inertia of the universe becomes matter. But matter is not some final reality. But now the question is, now that we've got consciousness and matter out of the way, what is spirit? Spirit is that which lifts consciousness up towards higher and higher planes. And in those higher and higher planes, you find a cosmic togetherness. In other words, what separates us now is our differing matter, and what lifts us into a community together, whatever it is we do that does, whether it's righteous action or singing harmony, whatever lifts us up, that's what constitutes that utopian community. And so a consciousness-raising activity is the kind of thing that you're going to find with these folks. The interesting thing is that the practice of Swedenborgian or New Thought or Zohar separatist worship, the language would be different, but the practice, the difference between a Shaker prayer and a Zohar separatist worship service would not be necessarily easy to tell. on the surface of it. And so I added at the bottom of this theosophical thing, because clearly you can use philosophy as a sort of a substitute for historical religion. There's something about the way that human beings think and the way they think together that has a tendency, when it's done in goodwill and when it's not done out of self-seeking, right? There's something that lifts us up and brings us together, and everybody knows that because we've all experienced it at one time or another. Now, this is when I usually leave the room, is when I'm a hippie, you understand, but when the hippies start getting all weepy and talking about cosmic consciousness and aren't we really all together, that's usually when I take my exit from the room. Maybe because it's just sentiment, or maybe because it's actually a little bit scary. I like being me a little too much to become a philosophical spiritualist, but that could be my mere fallenness, or it could just be that I'm a Methodist. In any case, Theosophy provides a sort of a systematic framework for people like me who want to think through it systematically, and yet it doesn't necessarily weight down the spiritual insights of these other kind of philosophical schools. So Theosophy is for people who just want to they want to put everything in systematic order. But what they want to put in systematic order is usually something like the Swedenborgian or the Quimby New Thought or something like that. Yes.
So this is different from, say, the Rudolf Steiner anthroposophy.
There's going to be some overlap between this and the Steiner. Steiner is similar to Swedenborg in the sense that there's a heck of a lot of physics behind it, and it's both a science and a worship of vibration. Swedenborg is more the mystic than Steiner is, and has what you might call a bigger cosmos that contains all kinds of things that Steiner never talked about. But Steiner, I think, does belong in this general, and like the Swedenborgians, they're not going to leave behind any of the science. And one of the things the reason I could call it philosophical scientific over here, but of course their understanding of science is bigger than just, than what generally passes for science in, say, the universities, people who are doing the natural sciences. They've got a bigger understanding of that. And they see spiritual significance in the ways that things vibrate, and the way that variable temporalities or flow together and flow apart, right? Okay, and then finally, some of the funniest. I had to list the secular ones over here. These are people who've really quite had it with all of that mumbo jumbo, it tends to be humanistic. This secular side, the ethical culture society, is really just collections of very good people in big cities as a general rule who understand that with the disappearance of religion and our outgrowing of what you might call the religions of the childhood of the human race, it doesn't mean that we don't need to get together and talk about right and wrong and justice and injustice and good and bad. And it doesn't mean that we've solved our fundamental moral problems, and we best solve them together. But the answer is ethical culture in this case, which is to say what we want to do is we want to develop a growing civilization or a growing culture that teaches people. So these folks are big on education. It teaches people to be good people as opposed to, seeking their own interest. It's selfishness just turns out to be the problem for everybody. Right? And then finally, I had to bring up the Owenites because we have harmony benches in there. One of the things that I was really delighted about when I saw the kind of list of folks that Francis Cape pulled from is it's like, holy God, he got benches from all over the place. Because the harmony group, the Owenites, these guys are secularists. They have an economic philosophy and they have a communal philosophy. It's pre-communism, but it's communalism. And their ideas are largely based on an understanding of economic relations among people. And they're big on equality, especially on the equality of gender and race. I happen to come from a place, Carbondale, Illinois, which is only a stone's throw from New Harmony, Indiana, which, by the way, the Harmony Society bought from the Rappites, which was a German pietist Christian group, but it wasn't working for them, but they'd set up a really nice material culture for, has anybody here ever been to New Harmony, Indiana? Oh man, it's a long ways from here, but if you ever get a chance, stop by, but it's not on the way to anywhere, sorry to say. Paul Tillich is buried there, by the way, if anybody knows who Paul Tillich is. He's buried in New Harmony, Indiana. But anyway, the Owenites have an economic philosophy, which is they understand among themselves that what separates them from one another and destroys or ruins their community has everything to do with the inequalities that develop as a result of improper distribution of ownership, and ownership is the problem. And then there are the Fourierists. This really is the hippie commune here. This is free love, but it's hierarchical, and so you should look it up and read about it. That's pretty wild stuff. These folks came from France, and they followed this this fellow who believed that there were levels of equality and a hierarchical order, and it's entirely secular, and it's based on some principles that are economical, political, and philosophical all together. But they founded the town of Utopia, Ohio, so you should look it up. I'm going to leave that for you to. It's pretty wild stuff. I don't think I'd be pretty surprised if there's anybody in this room who's comfortable with what they do or did. So, in any case, because it's the strangest combination of ideas I've ever seen in my life. But the point is, they're the ones who were brave enough to call the town Utopia. Right? All right. So, I mentioned the furniture and how the eternal is in the temporal. But one of the things that you got to turn loose of in order to get your mind around these, especially the Shaker ideas of the presence of eternity in your next act and your next deed, is you got to turn loose of this idea of progress. If you exist in one of these utopian societies, you've already arrived. You're not going anywhere. And so there are a lot of Amish who live around where I do, and they don't understand themselves as utopian. But they largely reject what you might call the developing modern technological world. They don't reject it 100%, but they have to have very serious conversations every time something new comes along as to whether or not they're going to invite this energy into their group. Now, autonomous groups of Amish tend to make different decisions about different things, and so you're going to find some groups of Amish that, for example, will not put rubber on the wheels of their buggies. Another group that will. Should we invite rubber in? You know, what's the effect on us if we do? And you guys have the same sort of thing in your daily lives. I know that I decided not to get a cell phone when they came out 20 years ago, and I don't regret that at all. I still don't know how to use one. I have an old one here that I don't even know how to get messages on, but it's enough to get if I have a flat on the freeway. So there's my compromise. I don't have a cell phone. Just a second, is it off? That's kind of how these communities have to deal with progress, if by what you mean by progress is this constant encroachment on our forms of association with one another, that you know a little, the camel's nose, it gets under the tent, and before you know it, right? Everybody's watching the television and nobody's talking to each other, or everybody's online. I saw a wonderful thing on the internet. It's a picture of kids walking across college campus, every single one of them messing with their machine, and the caption said, "Here's your zombie apocalypse." Right? So anyway, I mean, you know, it's that little thing that doesn't seem like it matters. It has huge effects on our forms of association. The folks who are serious about community have to find, in the sense that's going to be relevant to these benches, not only do they have to see eternity in the next act, but they have to understand something about how they relate to the world. Progress for them doesn't become progress towards some goal that they don't already have. It's like John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which is to say this is an exploration of a world that's already simultaneously existing. And the only question is, what is Pilgrim going to find next in this grand? If you think about it, it's sort of like Madame Blavatsky's schema of the theosophical schema of the universe, except that John Bunyan depicts his pilgrim as wandering around finding first this and then that and then the other. And you can't really even make sense of the cosmos to which Pilgrim belongs. But it's called Pilgrim's Progress. What it really means is the series of things that Pilgrim is going to have to face, because Pilgrim is Pilgrim and the world is what it is. Progress then has to do with overcoming whatever it is that comes your way. And it doesn't matter whether it existed before or only exists now, because we're not living in a temporal world. Our utopia is an eternity that exists now. And so that means that it doesn't matter when something showed up. If you think about old religious people that you might have known, like your grandparents, or perhaps some of you even knew your great-grandparents, it's amazing how unimpressed a lot of those folks were, if they were religious, with the new stuff that would come along. It's like, so you got that, do you? Okay. No, Grandma, look, it's fun. Sure. That's progress in Bunyan's sense. Progress is being able to walk away from, let's try this new thing. Because there's a certain wisdom about the presence, well, I hate to use this language, the presence of the devil everywhere, right? The devil's everywhere. The devil always was everywhere. The devil always will be everywhere. It might come in a little device this week. It'll come in another device next week. It's the same. There's nothing new under the sun. Eternity is here now, and progress is this. It's being able to walk away from it. Right? Okay. Finally, word of Royce. Right? I won't spend too much time on it because, as a matter of fact, I've already said everything he thinks. You've already got it in front of you. What you don't have is the arrangement of it yet. So this guy, he became one of the world's most famous philosophers. He grew up in Grass Valley, California, and his parents were Campbellites. His father was the no organ type, and his mother was the yes, let's have an organ type. His father was gone most of the time selling fruit to support the family and wasn't actually very good at that, so he was raised mainly by his mother and his older sisters. That was probably for the best. But Royce was a very detached young man. He wrote his first philosophy book when he was 8 years old. This is not a common psychology, to be so fundamentally detached from your life as you're living it at such a young age. His family recognized that he was unusual, and so they moved him here where he could get an education. He went to what's now called Lowell High School here. It was called Lincoln High School back in the day. Do you know they used to wear military uniforms there? Royce didn't like that. They beat him up too. The other boys didn't care for the young man. Part of the reason is that he made them feel uncomfortable. But he didn't feel uncomfortable about making them feel uncomfortable, and he didn't mind being beaten up. That was okay with him. There's an astonishing kind of serenity in this guy, but here's what it was like. You know those moments in your life when you have a little voice in your head that narrates what you're doing to you as you're doing it? It's like, oh, there you go again, Randy. Are you going to really have another glass of wine? It's like, well, I shouldn't go into my confessions here, but are you really going to have another glass of wine? Why, shut up. As a matter of fact, I am. What if that were your strongest voice, and what if it never shut up? That's what it was like to be him. His dominant voice was that narrating voice. And his wasn't configured spiritually the way William Blake's was. His was configured philosophically. It wasn't a religious voice. It wasn't telling him Jesus is coming or the devil's going to get you, or constantly telling him that, that somehow he wasn't good enough. Rather, it sat there narrating, critiquing what needed to be criticized, and praising to some very limited extent, but never to allow ego to get out of hand, praising what he was getting right. It's a hard life to live like that, and thankfully not many people have to. He had a nervous breakdown in 1888, but only one, and he came back and he was all right after that. We're not going to get a tragic story here. What we get instead is a really interesting interpretation of community and what it means to be a member of one. Because he could narrate to himself his own efforts to try to be in community with people, and it all came out more or less systematically as he was doing that. He had ideas that people just really hadn't heard before, and I can only give you a couple of them today. But in particular, he's a postmillennialist, progressive restorationist, universalist, communitarian, secular, and philosophical, and his utopia he calls the beloved community, and yes, that is where Martin Luther King got the phrase. The beloved community is Royce's idea. Here's how it works. It exists now, but only in an indeterminate form. We are all in ideal community, even as we speak. The difference between our enjoying that community and the situation we are in fact in is voluntary effort. Voluntary effort does not mean free will. It means thoroughgoing devotion to the beloved community as our sole cause and as the only thing that we serve with all that we have. How do we do that? Well, it turns out that our loyalty to that community that exists now in indeterminate form, our loyalty to that is what love really is. It's agapic love. When you experience agapic love, what you're really experiencing is loyalty, the best part of yourself, to something that's actual now, but is indeterminate now, because it would join us all together. This is more than getting your head in a beautiful place, because it turns out that you will fail, no matter how hard you try, to bring determination to the beloved community. But that doesn't mean that your loyalty to it is wasted. When you are loyal to it, and when others are loyal to it, we recognize that loyalty in one another, and that can be true even when we're serving different causes. It can be true even if we're on different sides of a war. He was not a pacifist. He wasn't even a nonviolence person. Loyalty exists in people who are actually killing each other. This is a disturbing idea. There is such a thing as loyal combat. There's a right and a wrong way to do this. Never, never fight with your foe in such a way as to destroy his or her loyalty. But that doesn't keep you necessarily from fighting a war. The beloved community exists even in the midst of war, and it joins those on either side. Misguided loyalty, not if it's to the beloved community. And so the result of acting in this way is that we become gradually not loyal to our causes, but to one another and to what's best in one another. Loyalty to loyalty. You can only do something wrong when you crush somebody else's loyalty, or you fail to act on or choose a cause to serve that brings what's best out of you. If you're not serving something, you are doing the wrong thing. You're wasting your life, right? Community is constituted by people who are serving together. So, it exists now, but due to a lack of voluntary effort, it's hard to see the beloved community. So, it turns out that we are social all the way down, that we do not have selves that we bring into this life, but rather the selves that we have are made through our actions in concert with other people's actions. He doesn't believe in the self. He believes that the thing you call a self is a residuum of what you've done. You didn't have a self when you got here, you made it through your actions. Right? It's not a dead residuum, it's a dynamic residuum that continues to assert its relevance in the present and in the future. But you didn't have it, you made it by acting, and every single one of those acts you didn't know the meaning of until it had an effect on somebody else. You find out what you have done when you see how it affects other people. And that's what takes root inside you. It's other people's responses to what you have done. The self, then, is constituted by a kind of dynamic doubt about whether you've done the right thing when you've done something. Your whole self is a great big twisted doubt from the past. Here's the good news. It does not determine your next act. Your next act is voluntary. It's not exactly to say that it's free. Freedom is too big a word to describe it. It's voluntary. To say this is free is to give it a kind of an exaltation it's not likely to have, and in fact, probably not 0.1% of the actions that an ordinary human being engages in a lifetime could really be described as free. But they are voluntary. And what that means is that nothing about my past and that thing I call the self, which is that knot of doubt and regret about what I've done in the past, nothing about that makes me do this rather than that. So you want to change the world, do this and make it count. Do you know what you're doing? Well, you will in a few minutes when you see what its effects are. But you can't know what its effects are going to be as you enact it. It's an act of faith. It's a leap of faith. And so you can guess, and you can guess with more or less accuracy, but you know it's fallible. You could be wrong. You'll know what you've done when others respond to it, and then it becomes a part of your past. So what do? In order to be a good person, I acknowledge that all of my past acts really happened and that I really did them. And if you do the same, then we share a community of memory, which is to say, we're being forthright about what we've done and the effects on one another, because there is no act that's not fundamentally social. If there was, I could never learn what I'd done, because it would have no effect on you. Right? This is why you have to pay reparations for slavery. That doesn't mean it has to be money. But right at the moment, this particular nation is still in denial about what it did. We haven't learned how to own a common memory of what happened. It's hard. Angela Davis does a good job of talking about this particular problem. She says that white people just never learned how to talk about what they'd done after slavery. And now we're 6 generations down the line, and there is nothing to teach white people how to talk about that. The community of memory is missing. And when the community of memory is missing, because we don't have the same memory as the folks who were slaves, let alone the ones who were subjected to genocide as the Anglo-Europeans spread across this continent, without that community of memory, we don't share the same present. We lack the same present. There is no world of truth because my truth is missing a ton of its past, right? So he says, acknowledge a world of truth, that the selves that we carry into this are dynamic residuum of our social experience, and we will be able to interpret and understand one another. If we share the community of memory, then it's possible for us to interpret one another effectively in the present. Then we have to anticipate the beloved community, and that's progress in the sense that I just laid out with Pilgrim. Anticipation doesn't mean in some deferred future. It means progress in the present towards the determination of the beloved community that exists now. And so he says there's a spirit of interpretation, or an interpreter's spirit, that hovers above every community as it strives to serve the beloved community. And that interpreter's spirit, you call it God if you want to, but he doesn't. That interpreter's spirit is literally nothing more than our collective will to understand each other. It involves being honest about the past, and being honest about the fact that you have experience that I don't have in the present, and about the fact that if we do the right thing, which is to say, if we're loyal to the beloved community and we serve it to the best of our ability, it becomes this much more determinate in each act. And that's the best you can do. Now, how do you think of it? he says the community is actually a person. It's not a human person. It exists at a higher level of generality. But it's a more important person than any human person because it lives longer. Part of the reason that we are social to begin with is so that we can make progress in the relevant sense of the word. But we won't live to see all of the fruits of our individual acts. And so, if we think about the community as the person we serve, then the question is are we making a person that's sociopathic? Welcome to the modern day corporation. The people in the building serving that person are making themselves largely, not every corporation, largely, they're making themselves a sociopathic person. A person that's not responsible for its own actions. A person that's on the wrong path. A person that's constantly in the position of denying realities of other people's experience in the present and in the past. In fact, it's psychopathic, the typical corporation. And in fact, the typical municipal government, the typical state government, these are defective persons. But the reason they came to be this way is that we didn't think of them as persons to begin with. If we had thought of our communities as persons, and so you've heard this argument, corporations now have the legal standing of persons. You see a lot of people upset about that. I would say, no, corporations need to have the legal standing of persons, as does every other community. But the trouble is, that means that you hold a corporation accountable the same way you would an individual human being. Right? At the appropriate level of generality. All right, well, if that's the case, then we have a new meaning for material and spiritual culture, are occasions of interpretation. Where you find material culture, where you find spiritual culture before you, what you really have is an opportunity to form a loyalty to the beloved community and to act in such a way as to serve it. One of the things that Royce liked about what he was doing is that it's completely secular. And yet, it doesn't exclude the religious service of anyone. It's ecumenical from the standpoint of Christianity. It involves and takes in all of those various Christian points of view, but it's not religious. Loyalty is agape, but it doesn't depend upon a particular historical story about the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus or anything like that. It would exist in exactly the form that it exists now, even if that had never happened. Our configuration of our community and the eternity of our community and the present of our community in our next act, that thing just doesn't depend on any particular history in order to get its meaning. It depends upon our present interpretation of one another in light of a common shared past and in light of an anticipated future. So, there's some ideas from Royce about the community, and thank you for your attention. Now, we're supposed to go over to the benches and have our discussion there.
We have refreshments too.
Oh, yay, yeah. All right, well, see you.
As an extra incentive. Not that you need one.
Yeah.
These uncomfortable benches.
Well, you don't have to, you can always wander around and switch benches when one of them gets. Right. All right, we'll see you over there then.
Thanks so much.
All right, are there any observations, questions? Anybody? Yes, sir, Adam.
You were talking about Royce and how past action kind of preserves in this kind of negative way.
That's right. That's what he says, anyway.
Does he talk about why action in general would be preserved, or why what about virtue, what about,
Well,
the world just messing around?
Without going into just grand detail about how every detail works, I can give you sort of the practical answer to the question. Here's the thing. Every action that you undertake, there are really only two possibilities for it. One is that it meets no resistance at all. if that happens, it's not going to become a part of your past. In other words, how many things do you do in a day that meet no resistance? They don't become a part of memory. The only stuff that becomes really a genuine contributor to your past is the stuff that is done against at least some resistance. And so, and it's the same thing with your thinking, by the way. Everything you're thinking about precisely because you don't know what to think about it. The thoughts that you're having that just flow right into, action, they don't become a part of the history of your thinking. You don't learn anything intellectually from them. And it's the same thing spiritually, which is to say, where there's no resistance, there's no progress in the relevant sense of the word. And so the reason that the self is this knotted thing of guilt and all of that is because it has to do with the uncertainty and all those other feelings that you acted against and the resistance that you overcame that made it a part of your preserved past. You really haven't finished your past. And you can tell because your inner life is that churning dynamism of what you haven't necessarily done right or haven't necessarily done yet because you don't know how to interpret it yet. Now, the fundamental act of interpretation, he says, that we get once we become mature human beings is the present self interprets the past self to the future self. And so we form a threefold community individually. My task in the present is to interpret my past self to my future self. It's actually a pretty vital activity. That's part of the reason why when the little voice says, "Are you really going to have another glass of wine, Randy?" That's if you will, that's the interpreter spirit hovering above that says you're about to interpret your past self to your future self in the mode of inebriation. And when you arrive at that future self, you're not going to be good for very much, especially not for driving, right? Or doing any logic, or editing, or writing. In fact, there aren't all that many things that you can do in that condition, except, well, I don't know, 1 glass of wine, better philosophical conversation. 2 glasses of wine, BS, right? but in any case, so the reason is because if there's no resistance, it doesn't stick. It doesn't stay with us. It doesn't carry forward. Same thing with your thinking. In order to learn something, you have to doubt. And everything you're thinking about is made of doubt. Good question. I don't know whether you accept it, but yeah. Yes, Matthew.
I was thinking about, before you got to Royce, I was thinking about the role that belief played in each of these communities, daily lives, lifestyles, and practices. And then once you started talking about Royce, I started to second guess what we even mean by belief. Usually, a belief is something an individual holds to interpret their world for themselves.
Yeah, he's not very impressed with belief.
Right, so I guess that's my question. What does Royce think about belief? And he was himself a metaphysician, right?
Right.
Those types of questions.
But he wasn't a believer.
Right.
But the reason is that he thought that things like belief and certainty, they were feelings that we have about certain kinds of thoughts and collections of thoughts that we have. And there's nothing so wrong that somebody hasn't felt certain of it. Right? And so he throws out belief, he throws out certainty, he throws out things that he believes are primarily justificatory orientations of feeling towards thought, which frankly is not going to yield to those feelings. Thought has its own kind of ordering. It's not wholly independent of feeling by any means, but it won't yield before, and the order of it won't yield before feeling. And in fact, what will happen is that if you mix your thought with your feeling too much, you're going to end up covering over the world of truth and the world of the acknowledged past. There are some things too painful to remember, but you still have to remember them from his point of view. It doesn't matter how you feel about it. Check that at the door when it comes to memory. He says you've got to do it because you can't live in the real present unless you've got the acknowledged past from which it came. Part of the reason is you can't interpret the present without that. And so belief is replaced with interpretation by Royce. And so if you want to know what happened to belief, it became the will to interpret. Yeah, which is a social activity. Belief is subjective, it can be idiosyncratic, it can be utterly useless and people still hold on to it tenaciously, right? And he says he just doesn't see that all of those shared beliefs that these various groups of folks would have, that's not really what made them a community. What made them a community is what they did. Yeah. So I don't know, does that answer your
Well, I
question?
guess, what would you say about the role that religion, religious tradition plays in the formation of a community, even if it's just initially? Does that, I mean, how do you bring a community together without some shared ideals that may take the form of beliefs?
Yeah, without shared ideals, you couldn't do anything. But there are plenty of ideals that aren't essentially religious. The religious ideals would just form like one kind of general cultural collection of ideals. And not always the best ones in his view. But if you're asking the question about a spiritual orientation on reality, that's what gives ideals to anybody. It's just, but you don't have to be religious to have it from his point of view. It doesn't hurt. I mean, he's not anti-religious at all. It doesn't hurt. It can hurt, but so can anything else that you grow up with, where somebody hands you something that you haven't won through your own activities of interpretation. If somebody hands you a set of answers to the toughest question in life, and you take that as a substitute for actually living your way through it and finding what's true and not true in it through service to your causes, basically. If you just accept that, then you don't even have beliefs. You don't have anything that you can interpret. I mean, a set of dogmas isn't even a set of beliefs. It's an uninterpreted life. Right. So, does that?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Since some of these utopias came to an end before they wanted to,
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd like to say something about Royce's idea of lost cause.
Oh, yeah. It turns out that the structure of spiritual growth is a little more complicated than I was able to say in the amount of time I have. But one of the things, and I'm going to put it real fast, just so that you see what the process looks like. If you serve a cause loyally, you will come to the point that you can't tell the difference between your service of the cause, your love of the cause, and your limitations and your mistakes. In other words, you'll come to the point that you blur the lines between your actions that really come out of a finite and fallible perspective on it and the real cause. And when that happens, because you've over-identified with the cause, right? And you aren't the cause, you are a servant of the cause. But when you've worked hard and long for a cause, you come to the point that you can't tell the difference anymore between your next act and what would count as genuine service to the cause. When you do that, you will betray your cause. Why? Because you've lost your fragmentary perspective, which is the only thing that attracted you to the cause to begin with. It was bigger than you are. And so when it's been thoroughly internalized and it's become your whole past, and you can't imagine yourself without your cause, you will do something that's going to undermine the cause. He calls this original sin. He also thinks that very often we feel that we are undermining our cause as we are doing it. In other words, we know this about ourselves, that we've lost perspective, that we've come to a point that we can't any longer judge whether our service is excellent service, and we become unwilling to see whether it's crushing somebody else's loyalty, because we've taken into ourselves things that we call principles, which are in fact nothing other than congealed ego, right? And so we tread on somebody else's loyalty, and in so doing we betray not only our cause but theirs, and the cause of loyalty to loyalty itself. Now, you're going to become aware of this in all likelihood once you've done it. And he calls this the hell of the irrevocable. The hell of the irrevocable means you did something that you can't undo. But that's true of every single act. But this act, in which you undermine your own cause, this act is the one you would take back if you could, but you can't. But neither can you stand it for anybody else to be in charge of that act. So it's your act. You take prideful possession of your act by which you betrayed your own cause, and you become judge, jury, and executioner of you. Right? Having done that, you can exist there forever if you like. Or you can let somebody else play out of it. Won't be just one person. But Royce talks about how it is that usually, if atoning work is going to be done, there will be somebody who takes the lead on it. So, you can't pull yourself out of the hell of the irrevocable, and you won't let anybody else do it until the moment that he calls grace appears. Sort of like, I like to think of it as that moment when the ancient mariner in Coleridge's poem, who can't die, and he's surrounded by, dead sailors, and they're in the doldrums, and there's no water to drink. And it's a pretty good description of what hell would have to be like. Does anybody remember what happens and when things turn around for the ancient mariner? Yeah?
Doesn't he look at the sea snakes and see what is beautiful?
Yep. So this would be like a Roycean moment of grace. So there's one more thing that you need to say. He doesn't just see them as beautiful. Well, he sees the beauty. The next line of the poem is, he blesses them unaware. For Royce's sense of grace, you have to do something. But it's not like you will know in advance that that's the act by which the door is opened to your atonement. But here's the bad news. No matter how hard your community works on your atonement and to reconcile you to the community, it's never complete. The betrayal is never taken away entirely. This is not a Christian theology of wiping clean. You can see why, given his view of the past and of memory, that reconciliation could never be complete, right? Because that would be a matter of acting as if things had never happened that really had. So, the rest of the story, Robert, is that the community is the great instrument of atonement, but the best service is the service to a lost cause, which is the service that you're capable of rendering after others have done the work of atoning for you. So, in other words, your cause is lost because it can't be restored to you in the way that you served it to begin with. But now your service will be better. Why? You can finish the story yourselves at this point. Why would your service to a lost cause be better than the initial service you rendered when you thought you could attain your cause? Yes.
I don't know.
But that's a good answer.
It might have something to do with a sense of self. At the beginning, you have some agency, and think, oh yes, I can push the wheel forward, and it will.
Right.
And therefore, I have some effect on it.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, when you see the wheels turning, whether you're on it or not.
That's right. I think that's right, because it's not just a loss of ego, and it's not really a loss of self, because those are still there, actually. They're there in the form of your past and all your regrets and all of that stuff. It's all still there, and so it's not a self-overcoming in the old religious way of thinking about a self-overcoming. Rather, what has happened is that you have come to see what part your service plays in the whole, right? And because you have allowed others to do for you the work that you can't do for yourself, you have, it's not a self-abnegation, it's not that kind of limitation. It is rather a recognition of your place in the community, the vitality of your service. So, quiz time. What kind of person is likely to be best qualified to do the atoning work for someone who is in the hell of the irrevocable? A young servant of the cause? Not general.
Someone who's already been through.
Exactly. Somebody who sees that you're a lost cause. But that's okay. It's all right to be a lost cause because we all are, in the relevant sense of the word. By the way, Royce is not big on happiness. So, for example, I mean, he's hard news when it comes to this kind of thing. So you lost someone that you couldn't afford to lose from your life, right? That person died. You say to Royce, "What shall I do? What shall I be? What shall I come?" Why did that person die? And Royce says, because God didn't need that person anymore. That's what he said. It's harsh, man. But you're not dead, and God still needs you. If you want to put it in terms of God, then it's a question of whether anybody actually dies at the wrong time. From the standpoint of community, not really, because the early or untimely death or absenting of a member of the community is very much to be expected, anticipated, and understood as an opportunity to turn a grief into what he calls a sorrow. A grief means trying to wish away the world in which this awful tragedy can befall you. But the atoning work transforms grief into a sorrow in which you embrace the world which made possible all of the things that the presence of that person, I almost said made possible, but what I want to say is made actual, right? So the presence of that person made all kinds of things actual. Your grief wishes that away, right along with the tragedy that took the person away from you. So when he says God didn't need that person anymore, it's harsh, but it says be careful because you're indulging a grief instead of developing a sorrow. And a sorrow is what's on the far side of every grief. He doesn't try to rush things up, and he knows that things like this unfold at different rates for different people, and different losses are harder to take. But you have to engage in the next act, and you have to acknowledge the world of truth that you live in now, as well as the world of memory that includes that person. Do you anticipate that person in the future? Yes, as a part of the beloved community that's the eternal present now. Make some effort, is what he would say. You really don't want to go to him for grief counseling, though. He was pretty tough. So, anyway, maybe one more.
So what was the practical implementation of this philosophy in various communities? At the end, what it comes down like main guidelines for actually communities that live based on his principles, if you know?
Well, loyalty to loyalty is something to shoot for. If we had just a little more of that, our Democrats could talk to our Republicans. There used to be a notion of the loyal opposition. It's the same thing inside of families, which is to say, families that fall apart or fall into permanent disrepair. Loyalty to loyalty can fix that, which is, my brother or my sister. We're irrevocably divided on the question of how to take care of, say, my mother. Right? But can I learn to recognize that, say, my brother or sister's loyalty to the mother that we share is what's best in that person, and to act on that instead of on the differing decisions that we might come to about how to solve this problem or that problem or the other problem. In other words, there's really nothing more practical than this, because you can find this structure in every situation. The absence of a will to interpret one another is the death of the community. You got to stay in the game. The way you stay in the game is you look for what's best in the other person. You try to find what that person is serving. the temptation to say that there's just nothing higher going on in those who disagree with us is a grand temptation. You're just in it for yourself, right? We will want to say. But is that true? It's actually almost never true. There are sociopathic people, but they're extremely rare. The vast majority of acts of the vast majority of people are in service of something. And that something is usually inherently social in the sense of, at the very least, that person is trying to interpret his or her past to his or her present. And that's social enough. So I'm not saying sympathy is always the right. I mean, you heard how harsh Royce is when you've lost somebody. Sympathy is not, it can't be utterly absent, but that's not what I'm calling forth. I'm saying, I watch what you do, and at the very least, I know that you are using your present self to try to interpret your past self to your future self. Everything you do, whether or not you have that extra glass of wine, what could be more practical than that, right? Have a little sympathy, but you can also say, and is that really the future self you want to become tonight? And having become that self tonight, you have to live with that one and whatever that one chooses to do tomorrow, right? You end up with a lampshade on your head and pictures up on YouTube, and it's like, and so in a way, what I would say is the practical guideline is consult these objective standards every time you act, and ask where they stand relative to loyalty, simple, and loyalty to loyalty, the big thing, the service of the beloved community. It is a lot of work to constantly be consulting the beloved community and asking after the ideal, and yet it can become a habit. Some people could do it by meditating on a regular basis, others by praying, some could do it by thinking, some could do it by sitting down and writing a journal, but it is, and this is probably the best answer I can give to you, it is a reflective activity almost no matter how you do it. It's not going to be an unreflective activity. You have to bring your reflective life to bear on your practical decisions in one way or another. And there's lots of different ways to do that. So I don't know whether that helps, but that's the best I can do. It helps a little, okay. All right, well, that's probably enough. You guys have been more than patient. Here we are in these utopian benches. You guys do understand why Francis Cape asked for this kind of a setting. I've looked online, and everywhere this thing has been installed, the setting looks almost exactly like this. Why did he do that?
So you have nothing else to focus on?
That's probably part of it. I mean, just aesthetically speaking.
To express the simple lifestyle of people who have conventions.
Yeah. I think it's about simplicity. A lot of these utopian societies, one of the things that they're revolting against is the trappings of the world. And so you've got to have some trappings, but if you've got a setting like this, then all that much more attention gets focused on what little you do have, hence the quality of the work, right? All of a sudden in a room like this, it's hard that these benches become infinitely interesting. You put them in a stained glass cathedral, and you see what happens. But almost all of these societies, they were reacting against what you might call an overcomplicated life, and so this is complicated enough. You can focus on this, and you find eternity in this. Then you've found it. You've found what you need. You don't need the rose window at Notre Dame for that.
Tiny PS. So Ephrata, Pennsylvania, is very much like this, except it's wood, it's stark, it's frankly depressing. It's just really rough to be there and to live there. But Camp Hill in Pennsylvania has stained glass.
Oh, really?
And music, and
music.
fabulous. It's a living community for people who need special care. Yeah. Exactly the opposite of Ephrata. They both make benches.
That's interesting. Yeah, I tend to like fancy things. This is a little too austere for me. One of the things I guess you could take with you as we explore this thing a little bit more is, which one of these would you buy? if you got a good deal, right? I'm not talking about paying what an artist needs for it. I'm saying you wander into the antique store and it says $15.
The one on which I could put it back.
All right. Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at the exhibit catalog, they show a good number of them that do have backs. But Francis Kate not going to give us any of those,
No.
right? All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.